Everyone, I'm Brian Varnell with Varnell Retro and Vintage Collections, and on today's episode of the James Bond Jr. podcast, I'll be talking about episode 3, The Chameleon. This episode was written by Jeffrey Scott. Jeffrey Scott wrote many of the James Bond Jr. episodes. He's also the grandson of Moe Howard, who's Moe from the Three Stooges. He also starred in many of the Three Stooges films, including The Three Stooges Go Around the World in a Daze and The Outlaws is Coming, which also happens to be one of the earliest appearances of Adam West, aka the 60s Batman. He also wrote for many other cartoon shows like the Super Friends series, the 80s Spider-Man animated series, Captain N the Game Master, 90s Sonic the Hedgehog, and Dragon Tales. He also wrote one of my favorite cult classic animated films from the 80s, Star Chaser: The Legend of Orin. This was inspired by Star Wars, and it was also one of the first animated films to use a mix of both hand-drawn and computer animation. It was also one of the first 3D animated movies. Our villain of the episode is the Chameleon, who is voiced by Alan Oppenheimer, who's a very famous actor and voice actor. He starred in the original Westworld and Freaky Friday movies. He was the voice of Man-at-Arms and Skeletor in He-Man. He was also the original voice of Falkor and the Rockbiter in the first Neverending Story movie. He voiced several of the unmasked bad guys on Scooby-Doo, and he voiced the Watcher in the 90s Fantastic Four animated series. Now, this is the show's first solo bad guy. In the first episode, we had Scumlord, who was a stand-in for Blofeld, where the Chameleon has no connection to any of the Bond villains. Funny enough, Marvel Comics, who produced the James Bond Jr. comics, also had a villain called the Chameleon, who would take on the appearance of others. My first recollection of this character was on an episode of Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, which was also my first introduction to Captain America, the Submariner, and Doctor Strange. So now that I've talked a little bit about the behind the scenes of this episode, let's get into the story. It starts off on a dark, rainy night at an army base. A figure in a cloak approaches a soldier guarding the gate. The soldier asks for his pass to enter. The figure jokes and says, "Here's my pass," and pulls out a taser, stunning the soldier. He then drags the knocked out soldier near the bushes, then places his hand on his face, which then causes a mutation that makes him take on the appearance of the passed out soldier. The Chameleon, disguised as a soldier, enters the barracks where a high-ranking soldier makes a joke about the rain, only to be tased as well. The Chameleon's eyes glow red, and he now takes on the appearance of the officer. He asks a private who is coming from the back to bring out a 4-star general's uniform. As the private goes to get one, the Chameleon face begins to pull a Darkman and freak out, making him look like Macaulay Culkin in My Girl. As the private comes around the corner holding the uniform, he sees the deformed face, and faster than you can say pink elephant, the Chameleon grabs the uniform and runs off into the woods. Meanwhile, at Warfield Academy, James Bond Jr. and his friends, IQ, Tracy, Phoebe, and Gordo, are all getting ready to go to a field trip to Washington, D.C. In the previous episode, we got this awkward scene of IQ taking a bath, and in this one, we see Trevor wearing long underwear, which apparently is very itchy. James Bond Jr. asks, "What's Trevor's deal?" And IQ mentions that on a previous plane ride, Trevor got scared, so he sewed in a parachute into his long underwear. IQ then shows James Bond Jr. an FM radio tape player. Yeah, I know, the show is really dated. IQ has installed a homing device into the player because, sure, why not? They seem to always need homing devices on this show, so why not put one in a handheld radio player? Again, very dated. Tracy is all excited to go to the field trip to Washington, D.C. until Buddy takes a look at her passport and sees that it's expired. This means she has to stay at the academy with her dad. Needless to say, she is not happy about it. The Chameleon goes to an old building to see a doctor about fixing his face. I guess he and the Joker are both on the same random doctor in an old warehouse health plan. It's revealed that the doctor inserted a bunch of microchips into the Chameleon's face, so that's how he's able to take on the appearance of others. See, Liam Neeson should have thought of doing that instead of making some Mission Impossible exploding mask. And apparently, the rain shorted out the chips in his face, so that's why his face went all crazy. I guess the Chameleon, the Wicked Witch, and the aliens from Signs all have the same weakness: water droplets. A truck then pulls up to the building and 2 MPs get out. They enter the building and ask the doctor if they've seen the man in the photo who broke into the base. The doctor says no, he's been with a patient who just came out of surgery. The Chameleon has changed his face once again to fool the MPs. That is until they see the general uniform on the ground. As they turn around, the Chameleon sprays one of them with some sort of liquid that knocks one of them out cold, while the doctor chloroforms the other. The Chameleon searches the one he's super soaked and finds a note about a Lieutenant Casings that is meeting with the general to inform him about the break-in at the base. The Chameleon then heads to the airport to meet up with the lieutenant to stop her. Around this time, the group arrive in Washington, D.C., and Buddy goes to grab a cab for everyone. That's when Trevor sees a cabbie and asks, why does he not have a limo? The New York talking cabbie takes offense to Trevor thumbing his nose at him and drives off. We then see a female army officer walk past the group, only to have her briefcase knocked to the ground by some random guy running into the airport. All her papers fall out and Trevor says, how horrible. Phoebe, thinks Trevor is reacting to the running man who knocked over her briefcase. But in reality, he's responding to the female officer saying how women shouldn't serve because serving in the army is a man's job. The female army officer hears this and pretty much neuters him in front of all his friends, giving him orders like a drill sergeant, only to have him wither to the ground pathetically. So as Private Pyle lays on the floor, James Bond Jr. makes his move and hands the briefcase back to the army officer. That's when we find out that this is the lieutenant that the Chameleon is trying to stop. And now I see why Tracy had to stay at home. You can only have one love interest per episode. As they drive off, we see the Chameleon in a van with his goons following them. Lieutenant Casing then gives them a tour of Washington, D.C., starting with the Lincoln Memorial. James Bond Jr. asks what she does in the army, and without any regard to national security, she tells him that she works for internal security and that she's investigating a break-in at an army base. I guess this information was for all eyes? Buddy decides to stay behind to finish reading the Gettysburg Address as the rest go to visit the Washington Monument. The Chameleon sees them splitting up and follows the group with his goons. As the group prepares to enter the elevator in the Washington Memorial to go to the viewing center, a very fast-moving old lady rushes in, leaving James Bond Jr. and Lieutenant Casings in the elevator, now separated from the rest. The old lady tells them that she gets nervous with large groups. As Bond and Lieutenant Casings lean out at the viewing window, the old lady pushes them both out, leaving them dangling for their lives. I bet at this moment James Bond Jr. had wished IQ had sewn a parachute into his underwear. The Chameleon then reveals himself to both of them, telling them to enjoy the view. The rest of the group make their way up to the viewing center and find James Bond Jr. and Lieutenant Casings hanging by the tips of their fingers. Gordo is able to pull up Lieutenant Casings back through the window, but James Bond Jr. has slipped further down. Gordo says he needs to hang somebody down there that's tall enough to reach James Bond Jr. That's when they all look at Trevor, who I guess would rather have James Bond Jr. fall to his death because he's afraid of heights. Gordo then dangles Trevor out of the window, almost causing both of them to fall. Bond, knowing that Trevor has an undie chute, tells Gordo to let him go. As they begin to fall, James Bond Jr. gives Trevor a wedgie that shoots out the parachute. As they begin to land, James Bond Jr. sees the old lady get in a van and moves the undie chute towards the roof of the van. The Chameleon and his goons hear something, and when they peek out to see what it is, they see Trevor get caught on a tree branch, throwing him off the roof. James Bond Jr. is able to stay undetected as Gordo sees that he's too far to follow. That's when IQ mentions that the homing device in James Bond Jr.'s radio. See, I like how this episode gives you hints of stuff that might come in handy later on, and seem to work out right when they need them to. IQ and the gang then find Trevor and go to track down James Bond Jr. We then cut to the Pentagon, which is cool to see in a cartoon, and a general revealed that the army has new plans to build an Ed 209. I'm not kidding, it's an Ed 209, an oval body with 2 chicken legs and a Gatling gun on his shoulder, which makes me wonder, have these robots mastered the art of walking downstairs? James Bond Jr. is able to make his way to the Chameleon's hotel room 311. This is an odd coincidence because A311 is an inside joke used by animators and it appeared on shows and movies like Bobby's World, Rugrats, Toy Story, The Iron Giant, and even Fallout 4. I'm guessing most likely some of the animators in this show were graduates of Cal Arts. James Bond Jr. then pulled a Porky and peeked through the peephole to see the Chameleon talk about his plans on stealing Ed 209. I know that the robot has another name, but it's Ed 209. I don't care what this show calls it. It's also revealed that he's an agent of scum, and that's who he plans on giving the robot to. James Bond Jr. then tries to come up with a plan. That's when he bumps into a room service person, and he said that the food is for him and that he'll eat it in the hallway. He also mentioned that he needs a dinner jacket. We then cut to James Bond Jr. putting on this guy's shirt, vest, and tie, and he gives him some cash and tells him to keep quiet about it. Now we get to the part of the episode that's a bit controversial. And this show came out in a different time in history where stereotypes in cartoons were more common. James Bond Jr. said that the food the bad guys ordered is Indian food. So Bond gets the idea to wrap a large napkin around his head and don a very stereotypical Indian cartoon accent. One of the goons mentions that they didn't order any food, which is weird because the cart dude said that the plate of food was for room 311. That's their room. Maybe they just forgot? I don't know. The goon says that James Bond Jr. looks familiar and he yanks the napkin off his head. The Chameleon also recognized him as one of the people he pushed out the window. A fight then breaks out and James Bond Jr. knocks out one of the goons with the food bowl and tray, while the other pulls a gun on James Bond Jr. Not a laser gun, freaking handgun. This show doesn't play around. James Bond Jr. uses a wine bottle to shoot the cork out, hitting the goon, knocking him out too. The Chameleon then runs off with James Bond Jr. chasing behind him. IQ and the rest arrive at the hotel where the signal sent them. As they walk in the lobby, the Chameleon sees them and runs into a room to hide. James Bond Jr. tells his friends that the person they're looking for is somewhere in the hotel and they split up to find him. Trevor decides to guard the door, which is also a quick exit. The Chameleon then makes a noise that alerts Trevor. As he goes to check, both he and the Chameleon bump into each other, which causes the villain's face to go all Darkman again. Trevor, now scared, runs into the room and hides under the bed. Just then, two cops show up at the hotel. The Chameleon, seeing them, takes on the appearance of Trevor and begins to throw things at the cops. They both draw their weapons on him, again very intense, and they tell him to hold it there. The Chameleon then jumps out a window, leaving Trevor to be caught by the police, and he gets arrested. He gets charged with assaulting a police officer and gets put in jail. Buddy has to call Mr. Milbanks to tell him that Trevor went crazy, much to the anger of Mr. Milbanks. James Bond Jr. and his friends know that the only way to prove Trevor's innocent is to find the Chameleon. Lieutenant Casings mentions that the Ed 209 is being revealed at the Pentagon today, so they all rush over there knowing that's where the Chameleon is heading to. At the Pentagon, a senator is leaving the building, and he bumps into the Chameleon. Using the appearance of the senator, the Chameleon is able to enter the building unalarmed. He makes his way to the general's office and uses the same taser from the beginning to knock him out cold. He then takes on the general's face and heads to where Ed 209 is being tested. There we see the robot doing test attacks on other soldiers, and we see that fire and bullets don't harm it. The Chameleon, as a general, says he wants to try manning the robot himself and gets inside. That's when Lieutenant Casings and James Bond Jr. shows up to warn the general and the others. However, they're too late, and the Chameleon reveals himself and uses the Gatling gun on the Ed 209 to shoot their Jeep, making it explode. Casing tries to shoot it, but it does nothing to stop it. That's when James Bond Jr. says that he's got to get out of this building, so he opens up a gate and runs out, shutting it as he leaves. Lieutenant Casing is left behind as the Chameleon grabs her using the claw on the Ed 209. All of a sudden, James Bond Jr. breaks through the gate with a tank. The Chameleon drops Lieutenant Casing as Bond fires a round towards him, missing. The Chameleon then pulls a Bugs Bunny and bends the tank's gun barrel back like a piece of rubber. James Bond Jr. is able to escape, and that's when we hear him call the villain for the first time by his name, the Chameleon. James Bond Jr. is able to break a sprinkler line, causing the Ed 209 and the Chameleon's face to malfunction. The MPs arrive and arrest the Chameleon, who is now trapped under the robot. At the police station, Trevor is set free from jail. Lieutenant Casings arrive and said that the general has offered to give them all a free tour of the city. That's when Buddy mentions that he doesn't want to know what James Bond Jr. has been up to. This leads James Bond Jr. to jokingly say, "Oh, I've just been checking out the many faces of Washington, D.C. And there you have it, episode 3, The Chameleon. This is my favorite episode to date. I really enjoyed the animation, the action, and the voice acting in this episode. Also, knowing that the writer of this episode is the descendant of the Three Stooges is awesome in itself. On the next episode of the James Bond Jr. podcast, I'll be talking about episode 4, Shifting Sands, where we see James Bond Jr. and his friends go to Egypt on a trip and end up being in the middle of a plot to steal oil from the Middle East. Hope you enjoyed this episode of the James Bond Jr. podcast. You can listen to all new episodes on Spotify, and you can listen to all past episodes on the Varnell Retro Vintage Collections YouTube channel. Don't forget to follow me on Instagram at Varnell Retro Vintage Collections, where I post pictures of the random things here in my office. I'm Brian Varnell, and remember, danger lurks within every shadow.